The smoke was still rising when Caleb found her, crouched behind a charred crate, trembling like a leaf in a storm, her pale green dress soaked through with blood that wasn't entirely her own. Around her lay the ruins of a wagon train that had been alive just hours before. Splintered wood, scattered trunks, and the terrible silence that only follows violence stretched as far as the eye could see across the sun-scorched plains of Wyoming territory. Caleb had ridden through 100 hard places in his 40 years, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of this young woman, alone, wounded, and holding on to consciousness by nothing but sheer will. If you believe that broken people can still save each other, like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to this channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. Caleb Hurst was not a man people sent for when they needed saving. He was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, weathered, hollow-eyed, carrying the particular heaviness of someone who had lost everything worth having and stopped pretending otherwise. 3 years earlier, he had been a respected trail foreman with a wife named Martha and a small ranch outside of Cheyenne. Then the fever came, took Martha and their infant son in the same terrible week, and left Caleb with nothing but an empty house and a bottle he couldn't seem to put down. He had been drifting ever since, picking up odd work, sleeping under open sky, trying to outride a grief that moved faster than any horse he'd ever owned. He had only stopped that morning because his horse, a stubborn roan named Preacher, had refused to move past the ridge overlooking the valley. Caleb had cursed the animal, then looked down and seen the smoke. Something old and instinctive pulled him down the hillside before his mind had fully decided to go. Her name was Nora Whitfield, though Caleb didn't learn that until much later. She had a deep gash across her forehead and a bruised shoulder, but she was breathing, and her dark eyes were sharp with a defiance that impressed him even in that terrible moment. She flinched when he reached toward her, and he understood that flinch. It was the flinch of someone who had just watched the world turn savage without warning. He lowered himself to the ground slowly, set his revolver aside where she could see it wasn't pointed at her, and extended his hand with a gentleness that surprised even himself. He spoke quietly, telling her she was safe now, that he wasn't going to hurt her, that he was going to get her somewhere warm and looked after. He wasn't sure he believed all of it. But she took his hand. What Caleb did not know, what he had no reason to suspect as he lifted her carefully onto Preacher and rode toward the nearest town of Milford, Colorado, was that Nora Whitfield was no ordinary traveler. She was the sole heir to the Whitfield textile fortune out of Boston, Massachusetts, and she had been traveling west under a carefully arranged alias to meet the man she had agreed to marry through a discreet and highly reputable arrangement, a widowed landowner named Frederick who owned half of the county she'd been heading toward. Her trunks, now ash and splinters, had contained not only fine clothes and jewelry but legal documents, letters of introduction, and a bank draft worth more money than most men in Wyoming would see in 3 lifetimes. She had chosen this life not out of desperation but out of a quiet longing for something real, something that the drawing rooms of Boston had never once given her. But none of that mattered on the long, silent ride into Milford. What mattered was the way Caleb wordlessly handed her his canteen. The way he slowed Preacher on the rough patches of trail without being asked. The way he didn't pepper her with questions or treat her trauma like a story to be extracted. He simply rode beside her through the golden afternoon light, and for the first time since the attack, Nora felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not safety exactly, but the possibility of it. In Milford, Caleb spent the last of his money on a room at the boarding house for Nora and sat outside on the porch through the night, half awake, hand near his gun, making sure no one came looking for any survivors of that wagon massacre. He told himself it was just the decent thing to do. He told himself he'd ride on in the morning. He didn't ride on in the morning. Over the days that followed, as Nora recovered and the town's doctor declared her wounds healing cleanly, the two of them fell into a quiet, careful conversation about who they each were, or rather, who they had been before life had reshaped them so ruthlessly. Nora had not yet revealed the full truth of her identity, partly out of habit and partly because, for the first time in her life, she was being seen as simply a person rather than a fortune. And Caleb had not yet admitted, even to himself, that something in him that had been dark for 3 years was beginning, painfully and tentatively, to flicker. If this story is moving your heart right now, please like this video, drop a comment below, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that broken people are still capable of beautiful things. The truth came out on a Thursday evening, when a telegram arrived at the Milford post office addressed to Nora's alias, sent by Frederick's lawyer, asking after her safety and mentioning the Whitfield name plainly enough that the postmaster's eyes went wide. Caleb was standing right there when Nora read it, and he watched the careful composure on her face shift into something more complicated. She told him everything then, the fortune, the arranged marriage, the life she'd been traveling toward. She watched his face for the moment he'd pull back, recalibrate, start treating her the way men always treated women with money, like an opportunity or a problem to be managed. That moment never came. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said the only thing that mattered, that none of it changed what he'd seen in her eyes behind that burned-out crate. The woman who had held on through something unsurvivable. That was the only Nora he knew, and that was enough for him. She never did make it to Frederick's ranch. She sent a kind and honest letter instead, releasing him from the arrangement and wishing him well. And Caleb, for his part, finally turned back toward Cheyenne, not running this time, but riding with a reason, with Nora beside him, toward the small and achingly familiar piece of land where a man who had stopped believing in second chances was about to discover he'd been wrong. Before we close, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been saved by a stranger, or been the one to reach out a hand when it cost you something? Your story might be the one that changes someone else's life today. Some people come into your life during your worst moment and, without even trying, remind you that you are still worth saving. Caleb had ridden into that valley broken, drifting, and hollow. He rode out of it with a reason to stay. And Nora, who had crossed half a continent searching for something real, found it not in a grand estate or a carefully arranged future, but in a dusty, grieving cowboy who sat on a porch all night just to make sure she was safe. They were both survivors of different kinds of massacres, and together, slowly and imperfectly, they began to rebuild.